The son of the New Mexico Territory was a brutal, unyielding thing. It bleached the bones of the earth white, turned the adobe walls of the settlement into ovens, and seemed to leach the very color from the world. For Sarah Miller, 19 years old and already feeling ancient, the sun was just another relentless force conspiring against her. It beat down on the back of her neck as she stood on the splintered wooden porch of the town's only church, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sage, and the nervous sweat of the entire population of Cottonwood Creek. She could feel their eyes on her, a physical weight heavier than the ornate, suffocating wedding dress her mother had lovingly sewn from a bolt of ivory silk she'd been saving for a decade. The dress was a relic of a life that no longer existed, a foolish dream for a daughter who was now a sacrifice. Her mother stood beside her, a pale, trembling figure, her face a mask of grief held together by the thin threads of prairie stoicism. Her father, good man broken by a bad season and the threat of annihilation, stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping in his temple. He was a farmer, not a warrior. He had forced to choose between his daughter and his family, his apes, his very life. Colonel Turner, the man who was supposed to be their protector, stood officiously to her left, his brass buttons gleaming, his face red and bulbous. He was the architect of this day, the man who had brokered the peace by bartering away her future. The Treaty of Cottonwood Creek was an unspoken document, a blood pact written not in ink but in the currency of a young woman's life. For months they had been raided, their cattle driven off, their outlying homes burned. The Apache, led by the legendary warrior Charto, were a force of nature, striking like lightning and disappearing into the dusty horizon. The town was on the brink of collapse, its men too few and too frightened to fight back. Then, a desperate message. The colonel, a man of the old school who saw Indians as either savages to be exterminated or children to be controlled, had sent an intermediary. In exchange for an end to the raids, the Apache demanded a wife, a young, pure wife. The white man's logic was simple: show the savage the ways of civilization through the angelic influence of a good woman. A treaty by marriage. The irony was at lost on Sarah. Civilization had done nothing for her but deliver her into the hands of a stranger. The church doors swung open and the man they called Charto emerged into the blinding light. He was not what she had expected. He was not a stooped, painted fiend in a feathered headdress. He was a giant, tall and broad-shouldered, his skin the color of burnished copper. His black hair fell to his shoulders, unadorned except for his simple leather thong. He wore a deerskin shirt and leggings, both heavily fringed and adorned with intricate beadwork in patterns of turquoise and red. He was clean, his bearing proud and undefeated. A hush fell over the crowd, the silence more deafening than any war cry. He walked with a fluid animal grace, stopping a few feet from her. His eyes were black, deep and fathomless, and when they met hers, she felt a jolt, not of fear but of something else entirely. He didn't look at her like a prize. He looked at her like a puzzle, a complex equation he was trying to solve. Beside him stood his own people, a small delegation of warriors. They were not in full war paint, but their presence was a reminder of the power that lay beyond the town limits. Their faces were impassive, their eyes scanning the crowd with a wary, unblinking intensity. It was a standoff. Not her wedding. Colonel Turner cleared his throat. Sarah Miller, you have been given in marriage to Charto, war chief of this people, in order to secure a lasting peace. The words were a cold, ugly thing. There was no "do you take this man?" No pretense of consent. It was a transaction, finalized with a nod from her father. Her father stepped forward, his hand trembling as he took hers. He leaned in, his voice a ragged whisper in her ear. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Forgive me. I have no choice." She looked at him, this man she had loved and trusted her entire life, and saw a stranger, a weak man. She pulled her hand away. Forgiveness was a luxury she could not afford right now. It was a feeling for a future that, As of this moment, she no longer possessed. The Apache priest, an old man with a face like a weathered map, began to chant in a low, guttural language. It was haunting and alien, a sound that spoke of wind and rock and endless space. It was the antithesis of the gentle hymns she had grown up with. He circled them, sprinkling a fine dust of sacred pollen from a gourd. He spoke of the Creator, of the earth and sky. He bound their hands together with a strip of soft, white buckskin. The touch of Charto's hand was surprisingly warm and his calloused grip was firm. He didn't flinch, didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The ceremony concluded. It had taken less than 10 minutes to enter life as she knew it. The townspeople seemed to exhale a collective breath. It was done. The savages had what they wanted. Now they could go back to their lives. They would leave, and the nightmare would be over. Sarah was the nightmare, and she was leaving with them. Her mother sobbed quietly into a handkerchief. Her father was a statue of stone. Then Charto spoke. His English was clipped, precise, a sharp contrast to the wilderness surrounding them. To honor this union, he said, his voice deep and resonant, I bring a gift. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. A gift. What could an Apache warrior possibly give? A stolen trinket? A dried scalp? He gestured to one of his warriors, a younger man who was holding a soft, leather bundle. The warrior stepped forward, his movements reverent, and presented the bundle to Charto. The chief took it, his large hands surprisingly gentle, and held it out to her. Sarah Miller, he said, using her full name, a strange formality in this bizarre circumstance. My wife. The entire town watched, their curiosity now piqued. Sarah, her hands still bound to his with the buckskin, felt a flicker of defiance. She would not be impressed by a trinket. She would not flinch. She looked at the bundle with all the disdain she could muster. He nodded, prompting her. She used her free hand to gingerly pull back the leather. The fabric was soft and warm, smelling of smoke and sage. And inside, nestled on a bed of soft rabbit fur, was a book. Not just any book. It was a beautiful hand-bound volume, its leather cover a deep, rich mahogany, tooled with intricate silver filigree. The work was exquisite, far beyond anything she had ever seen. It was a work of art. The crowd fell utterly silent. They had expected a trophy, a war prize, a scalp, a knife, a gleaming piece of silver. A book was absurd, laughable, insulting. It was the white man's symbol of learning, the very thing they were supposed to be bringing to the savages. And the savage was giving one to her. Sarah slowly opened the cover. The pages were made of a fine, supple parchment. The handwriting within was beautiful, a strong and elegant cursive, in ink that had faded to a soft brown. It was a journal, and it was written in flawless English. She began to read, the words swinging before her eyes. The first entry was dated over 30 years ago. The sky is a magnificent, unbroken blue. I have never seen anything like it. Father says this land is empty, but it is not. It is full of a silence that is louder than any noise I have ever known. A gasp escaped Sarah's lips. She continued to read, her fingers trembling. My husband Charto led the hunt today, and was successful. The life here is hard, but it is honest. He teaches me the names of the stars and the plants. He is learning my words, too. It is a slow, careful dance of understanding. The journal was the story of a woman, just like her. A woman who had been taken, who had been forced to marry an Apache chief. Sarah was reading her own life, written 30 years before. The woman, Emily, had been captured in a raid, a young girl from a settlement in Texas, and the man who had taken her, the man who was teaching her the stars, was named Charto. She looked up from the book, her mind reeling. She stared into the eyes of the chief in front of her. His face was impassive, betraying nothing. The book continued. They tell us that our women are in danger. But he looks at me with a tenderness my father never showed my mother. He is not a savage. He is a man trying to live in a world that is being stolen from him piece by piece. He is a man who chose to love a woman who was his enemy. And I, foolish, terrified girl that I was, chose to love him back. Sarah's breath hitched. She flipped to a sketch, a detailed charcoal drawing of a young Apache man, his face strong and proud. It was the very face before her, but younger, untouched by the years of hardship that now lined Charto's features. Beneath the sketch was the caption, "My son." Sarah read the final entry. "The bluecoats are coming. They will take my journals. I know it. But if they find them, I want it known that I am not a victim. I chose this life. I chose my family. I loved my Apache. I loved my son. Tell them," I said, "do not forget the humanity in the eyes of the enemy." The book slipped from her fingers and fell into the dust. She was shaking, a violent tremor that coursed through her entire body. She looked from the book to the man to the stunned faces of the people of Cottonwood Creek. They were all looking at her, expecting her to be horrified, to scream, to denounce this final cruel trick. But all she could see was the pain in the young man's eyes, the man she had just been forced to marry. This was not a warrior's prize. This was a man carrying the weight of his mother's legacy. He had given her the story of a white woman who had loved his people, who had seen them as humans. He had given her proof that she was not alone, that what she was feeling was real. He had given her a reason to look at him and see a man, and not a monster. She slowly bent down, her bound hand forcing him to lean with her. She scooped the book out of the dust, cradling it to her chest as if it were a fragile, newborn bird. And then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She began to cry, not the dignified, silent tears of a martyr, but deep, racking sobs that tore from her throat. She cried for the girl she had been, for the future she had lost for Emily, and for the young man standing in front of her who had given her his most precious possession, his own mother's memory, in a last-ditch effort to be seen as more than a savage. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground. She didn't even hear her mother's sharp cry. The entire town was frozen in a tableau of confusion and shock. This was not what they had expected. They had wanted defiance. They had wanted tears of fear. But these were tears of revelation. She felt a large, gentle hand on her shoulder. Charto knelt beside her, his movements silent and fluid. He didn't speak. He didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He simply put his arm around her, a gesture of solidarity that was both shocking and strangely comforting. The crowd gasped. Here was the savage, the enemy, touching their precious white daughter. Sarah looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears. She saw the pain in his eyes, a deep, ancient sorrow that mirrored her own. He had lost his mother to the bluecoats, to a world that wouldn't let her have the life she wanted. He had been raised in the shadow of her struggle, and now he was repeating the pattern, hoping for a different outcome. He had given her the one thing that could save her, the one thing that could bridge the gap between them, the truth. Her bound hand crept up and brushed the tears from his own face, a gesture of instinct rather than conscious thought. "Your mother," she whispered in a broken voice. She was happy. A flicker of something, relief, gratitude, surprise crossed his stony face. "She was my heart," he said, his voice rough with emotion, his hand tightening on her shoulder. "She loved your world, and I loved her for it. I thought you might find something of her here." The townspeople stood in stunned, horrified silence. Colonel Turner took a step forward, his face a mottled red. "What is the meaning of this?" he blustered. "What has he done to her? Seize the book. It's surely some form of witchcraft." But no one moved. The colonel's authority, built on fear and the cold steel of his pistols, crumbled in the face of this silent, raw humanity. He was a man of orders and hierarchies, a world that had just been shattered by the contents of a simple leather-bound journal. It was Old Man Henderson, the town's reclusive scholar who finally broke the spell. He shuffled forward, his spectacles perched on his nose, his eyes wide with intellectual wonder. "If I may, Colonel," he said, his voice a thin, reedy whisper. He reached down and gently took the book from Sarah's trembling hands. She let him, too exhausted to resist. He turned the pages, his lips moving silently as he read. A hush fell over the crowd. He gasped. A sharp, uncharacteristic sound. "Good God," he breathed. It's the Cotter Journal. The lost journal of Emily Cotter." He looked up, his face pale. She was the daughter of a preacher from a settlement in Texas. She was taken in a raid. It was assumed she died. It was used as justification for 2 separate campaigns. But she lived. She lived, and she wrote this. He looked from the book to Charto, his eyes full of a new understanding. Her son. The revelation was a thunderbolt. Emily Cotter was a legend. Her story, a fictionalized tale of her martyrdom, had been the cause of untold bloodshed. And here, in the dust of a dusty little town, was the truth. The savage who was the antagonist in their stories was the hero of his own, a man raised by a white woman's love and a brown man's strength. Sarah looked at the faces of the townspeople. She saw confusion, shock, and in a few, the slow dawning of shame. They had bought the story of the bloodthirsty Apache, the savage who had to be tamed. But the book in old Henderson's hands told a different story. It told of a people who were not so different, of a woman who had found happiness in the most unlikely of places, and of a son who had risked everything to honor her memory. He had brought her story home, right into the heart of the very enemy that had destroyed her. Charto stood, pulling Sarah gently to her feet. He spoke again, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. "My mother wrote this for the world to see," she said. "Tell them I am not a victim. My gift is my mother's truth. Our truth. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of something the white man has forgotten. That a life can be built on trust, not hate." He reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, simple silver cross. "My father gave this to my mother on the day they married. She wore it until the day she died. It was the only thing she brought from your world that she loved." He took Sarah's hand, the one that was not bound to his, and placed the cross in her palm. "It was warm, smoothed by years of wear. Now it is yours." Sarah looked at the cross, then back up at him. The tears were still on her cheeks, but the paralyzing shock was gone. In its place was a profound, soul-deep understanding. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a partner in a new chapter of a story that had started decades ago. The wedding gift, the journal, wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a key. It was a way out of the prison of fear and ignorance they had all been living in. She clutched the cross and the journal. "Take me home," she whispered, her voice clear and strong, a direct challenge to her father and the colonel. She wasn't speaking to her father in the farmhouse. She was speaking to her husband, to the strange and terrifying world he represented. But it was no longer terrifying. It was just home. The place where a woman named Emily had found love and a purpose, where a man named Charto had learned to be both warrior and peacemaker. And she, Sarah Miller, was now a part of that story. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, a profound silence fell over Cottonwood Creek. It was not a fearful silence, but a reflective one. The sound of a single, clear note from a flute, played by one of the Apache warriors, drifted across the parched earth. It was a melody of mourning and of hope, a sound that echoed the silence of the town. Chato turned to face his people, his hand still holding hers, the buckskin binding them together. He spoke a few words in his own language. His warriors nodded, their faces softening. They had been ready to fight, to defend their chief's honor if this white woman, like so many others, had shown him disgust. but they saw the tears on her face, the way she clutched the book to her heart, and the way she had chosen him. They saw their chief's mother's words had taken root. Colonel Turner sputtered, his world of order and control in tatters. "This is preposterous. This is not a gift. It is a piece of revolutionary propaganda. You can't expect us to." "Colonel," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a blade. "This is my husband. This is my family. The treaty is sealed. The raids are over." Her eyes were clear, her voice steady. "And I have my wedding gift. I don't need your approval. I have my truth." She looked at the faces of her friends and neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, who had always been kind to her, had tears in her eyes. Sarah's mother was now being held by her father, who looked utterly lost, as if the ground had just been pulled from under his feet. Sarah realized that his weakness was not malice, but a failure of understanding. He had been raised on fear. The journal, Emily's story, was a stronger weapon than any rifle. It was a weapon of understanding. Charto began to walk, leading her toward the edge of town where the Apache horses were waiting. The path was bordered by the people of Cottonwood Creek, who parted like a sea before them. They were still looking at her, but now their gaze was different. They weren't looking at a victim. They were looking at a bride. She was no longer a symbol. She was a woman holding the story of another woman, walking beside her husband. They passed by the general store where the owner, Mr. Peabody, stood with his mouth agape. They passed the schoolhouse, its single room a monument to the civilization they were trying to impose. And as they walked, a strange transformation began to occur in the town. The children, who had been shooed away, started to whisper. They weren't whispering about savages anymore. They were whispering about the book, about the woman who had been happy, about the man who had brought a story instead of a weapon. The silence that had followed Charto's gift was finally broken by a sound that no one expected. It started low. A mumble, a cough, then a single clear word from a young boy. "Mama," he said, pointing at Sarah. "Is she going to be a princess?" A few people laughed, a nervous, bewildered laugh. But it broke the spell. The silence was gone. In its place was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The people of Cottonwood Creek were not cheering, but they were no longer condemned to a fearful silence. Emily Carter's story had become a bridge over the chasm of ignorance that had separated them for so long. It was a silence of truth, not a silence of fear. And in the heart of the woman